All right, so let's take a look at the second document in this lessons document, so the second page. This one is called Ethical Principles and Highest Goods, a Summary. You'll notice that I've used the common Latin phrase summum bonum for the highest good here, the end that gives all acts their value. I'll just begin by saying that we don't need to focus too much on these. They are included here, though, just so that you can see there is a difference. For Aristotle, the highest good is the beautiful. For Kant, the highest good is that you have a good will, the rational desire in yourself to do good in the world is, for him, the highest possible good. And then Mill, pretty straightforwardly, just says the highest good would be that everybody is happy, right? So not too confusing there. What a highest good is just, it's like where the buck stops. It's the thing that gives all other ethical decisions their value, right? So insofar as something is valuable in Aristotle, it's beautiful. Insofar as something is valuable for Kant, it demonstrates a goodwill. Insofar as something is valuable for Mill, it demonstrates that people are being happy, or all creatures actually for Mill are being happy. What I want to focus our attention on in this short video is the principles for each of these philosophers, particularly looking at Kant and Mill's principles. So Aristotle, if he has a principle, and you'll remember he was very clear that he doesn't have a rule, right? That the only rule we can have is to look at the, my goodness, okay, Bugaboo wants to say hi. Come here, Boo. Look, did you hear that big doggy groan? That's because she hasn't gone for a walk. There she is. She wants me to take her for a walk. So with Aristotle, he says you cannot have a rule for ethical action. The best that you can do is to look at the judgment of a person of good character, right? A person of high moral stature. But here he does have, I've summarized something that would be like a principle for him. Your actions should, oh, there's a typo here, let me fix that. Your actions should spring from a fully formed virtuous character that can choose the beautiful course of action every time, giving you the feeling of happiness as well as a beautiful character. So your actions should be coming from a certain sort of individual. That's the best advice that he can give us, right? Now with Kant and Mill, the principle really does take on the tone of not just being good advice, but of actually being like a rule that you're supposed to follow. And so as soon as I say a rule, you should be hearing universal, right? You should be hearing this idea that to know if I'm doing right, I just have to see if my particular actions line up with the universal. And so it's not necessarily a struggle any longer between the particular and the universal. I just have to say, cheating is wrong. I'm tempted to cheat. I shouldn't cheat. And there's never any circumstance in which cheating could possibly be okay because the universal overrides the particular in every instance. So see if you can see the focus on the universal coming out here, especially with Kant. I'll read his principle. Act only in such a way that you can will that your maxim, and for him, a maxim is just the reason for doing what you are doing, that be a universal law. So act in accordance with reason or act as the transcendental rational being would act. So this thing in quotes, the transcendental rational being, just means like think about the most perfectly rational creature that you could possibly think of. What would that creature do? That's what you should do. So his best example here is lying. There are times where we feel like we shouldn't, that we should lie, right? That we should, even though we know that lying is wrong, we feel like there are cases where maybe we should lie. And his suggestion here is that, and it's much more complicated than this, but his suggestion here is that as soon as I say I should lie in this circumstance, I am making an exception for myself, and I know that it's an exception. I feel that there's a conflict there. I have to gain for myself the admission that it is an exception. And by saying that it is an exception, I've proved the rule. I've said that really what's right is not to lie, but for some reason in this case, I should take exception to that. And he's saying, well, no, the fact that you feel that you need to take exception means that the universal rule is in fact a universal rule. And so if you have any moral wherewithal, if you are morally good, you'll follow that universal rule every time. So Mill, his principle, act in such a way that you can promote the most and best pleasure and minimize the most and worst pain for all sentient beings. This is known as Mill's greatest happiness principle. All sentient beings is a big ask, right? So on the one hand, you can see that this is a little bit more contextual and maybe not so universal because what's going to cause the most pleasure and minimize the most pain, seems to be, would have to have something to do with the creatures involved. But as soon as we start talking about all sentient beings, we're no longer talking about just my dog or just my family, or we're talking about all of the creatures, right? And so again, the focus being on a much more universal scale than Aristotle had ever intended, for example. So particularly with Kant, we see a focus on the universal over the particular. We also see a focus on the head, definitely, over the heart. Emotion should have nothing to do with your decision making. It should always be rational. And with Mill, there's an echo of that, although he starts to swing things back around towards a little bit more of a balance. And by the time Gilligan takes up the conversation in the work that we're about to explore, she's really saying there needs to be something of the particular involved in ethical decision making, and there needs to be something about emotion that plays a role in decision making. How can we reclaim those? How can we make those part of the broader conversation?